This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. We all expected a belligerent and aggressive China to keep going out of its way, bully its neighbors, and steal wealth and intellectual property of the West. It seemed as if a major conflict involving the entire democratic world on one side and China on the other would break out. However, China is going down in a relatively quieter mode. The Chinese economy is dying a slow and painful death. Some of its largest giants are suddenly collapsing, and it seems that the end of Chinese hegemony is near, but it is hardly as dramatic as the world had imagined. Hi, and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I'm your host Shubhangi, and in this video, I will tell you how Evergrande, a Chinese real estate giant, is at the brink of defaulting. Let's begin. The Evergrande Group, China's second-largest property developer, really captures the sudden downfall of the Chinese economy. In 2018, Evergrande became the world's most valuable real estate brand. Its brand value surged to $16.2 billion. However, Evergrande has now witnessed a shocking downfall. Its credit rating has been downgraded by two ratings agencies back-to-back, triggering fears of default by the real estate giant. Evergrande is too big a company to default. If it defaults, then it would be the final blow for China's highly strained economy. Evergrande's dipping fortunes could hit China's real estate market, ultimately affecting everything from the jobs market to property prices. This is why Fitch Ratings and Moody's Investors Service seem to have issued warning signs about the likelihood of a default by the Evergrande Group. Fitch Ratings has suggested that Evergrande has failed to address its worsening liquidity issues. Fitch Ratings has cut the real estate developer to CC, which is appropriate given that Evergrande has become the most indebted developer, and its ongoing cash crunch means that the real estate giant may not be able to keep creditors at bay. Fitch stated, "The downgrade reflects our view that a default of some kind appears probable." The credit ratings agency added, "We believe credit risk is high given tight liquidity, declining contracted sales, pressure to address delayed payments to suppliers and contractors, and limited progress on asset disposals." Earlier, Moody's Investors Service had cut Evergrande's rating to CA, which suggests that it is likely in or very near default. Evergrande admits its precarious debt situation. Evergrande itself issued a warning last week. The property developer suggested that there would be risks of default if it failed to raise cash. The overall situation is also going downhill for Evergrande. The real estate developer had managed to establish its huge empire with heavy borrowings and land grab. Last year, it managed to avert a debt crisis with help from the government and wealthy friends. However, Chinese authorities imposed rules known as the Three Red Lines to determine whether companies can take additional borrowings. After the new rules were imposed, Evergrande again fell into trouble. Evergrande hasn't sold a dollar bond since January 2020, and its shares have reached a nadir, briefly trading below their 2009 initial public offering price. To put it simply, Evergrande's likely default will be the final nail in the coffin for China's troubled economy. With over $300 billion of liabilities, any default by Evergrande would inevitably harm lenders, suppliers, small businesses, and millions of home buyers. In fact, the overall sentiment in the Chinese economy would dip further if Evergrande collapses. The fundamentals of the Chinese economy are already weak, with President Xi Jinping's tight regulatory measures and crackdowns on tech and edutech sectors causing an absolute carnage in the stock market. A default by the world's biggest real estate developer by value is therefore the last thing Chinese stock traders and investors would want. In fact, Evergrande, being a gigantic real estate company, would imperil the interests of many Chinese and foreign investors. Therefore, Any debt default by the real estate giant would completely erode investor confidence in the Chinese economy. The Xi Jinping administration has not said anything about Evergrande's dwindling fortunes. The Chinese authorities are in a catch-22 situation. If Evergrande defaults, then the entire Chinese economy will be affected profoundly. However, bailing out such a huge realtor wouldn't be an easy task for Beijing. Also, the risks involved with bailing out Evergrande are simply too high. If Xi Jinping decides to help Evergrande avoid default, then it might send a wrong signal to Chinese businesses that consider themselves too big to fail. Such businesses could start taking excessive risks because the government would bail them anyway if they run into trouble. Xi Jinping is facing a conundrum that invariably gets attached to the collapse of corporate giants. China's debt crisis has been haunting it for quite some time. The King Gold scam that surfaced last year showed how 4% of the communist nation's gold reserves were fake. China's largest privately owned gold processing and jewelry company had taken a loan of $2.8 billion with pure gold as collateral. However, the 83 tons of gold that the company claimed as pure gold was in fact gilded copper. Such incidents show just how deep China's gross economic mismanagement and concoctions are. Meanwhile, a debt crisis looms large on the Chinese economy, as many of its leading private firms, state-owned enterprises, and regional banks are defaulting frequently. China's troubles are, in fact, not limited to big corporate giants. The communist nation is also facing a micro-lending sector crisis. Fintech companies have been especially addictive for Chinese youth. These companies are often built seamlessly into e-commerce platforms or even get associated with other services like rental platforms. So, very often, Chinese citizens are borrowing more than they can repay. China's debt crisis was already going out of its control, with defaults across its financial sector. However, it seems that trouble is going to mount further for Beijing, and any default by Evergrande would inevitably slip the Chinese economy into recession.